Oh, good morning, John. It's good to see you again. We're recording this on the morning of the 4th of July. Um, John, a lot of politics happening in the world these days. We had the US presidential debate where President Biden performed really poorly, and now the betting markets and everyone else seems to think that either Biden drops out of the race or Trump is sure to win. So we're going to have to talk about that a little bit and what the implications might be for markets. At the same time, we've had the first round of the French elections with Marine Le Pen's National Assembly doing very well and President Macron's party coming third behind the far right and the far left. And then we've got Rishi Sunak in the UK, who's on the way out, and we should be expecting Sir Keir to lead the Labour government into a new government after, I think it's 12 years of Tory leadership in the UK. So a lot happening. What did you think of the Biden-Trump debate? Did you watch it, John?
Yeah, I watched a fair bit of it, and obviously getting YouTubed endlessly about the gaffes. Look, I think that it's clear that Biden probably has to not stand for re-election. That can't happen overnight, that sort of decision. So you got to go through the machinations and the backgrounding and the private meetings, and it's unfortunate. That's just how things happen, because it would be bad if, based on one debate, the president stood down. But I think the die is cast. It's bleedingly obvious that the issue is, can he be re-elected for 4 years, and what risk does that put for the American society, having a leader who clearly will struggle to last 4 years if he can't struggle 5 minutes into a debate. So that's what's going to play out. Is that going to affect markets? Is the real issue for us. Look, a recovery in the polls for the Democrats, may, if, on a decision to put in a new candidate, may have some effect. I think the bigger issue, Paul, and is that the valuation and the value of the American stock market is probably a bigger issue, and we'll get back to that a little later in this talk. In terms of Europe, UK, France, look, as I said and continually say, incumbent leaders, incumbent governments, there is a protest vote around the world. The middle and lower middle class are suffering cost of living issues. It's right around the Western world. It was caused, obviously, we know it started with COVID, and then it was magnified by Ukraine war, and the fact that outside Australia in particular, Western governments are very highly encumbered, and there's only so much they can do for their fiscal policy to support cost of living changes. Australia has incredible power to adjust cost of living because of our balance sheet strength and our low government debt. That's not the case in Europe or America. And so I think we're going to get this. The result is governments can't move, Paul. They can't do what they would normally do, and there'll be a voting backlash. Doesn't matter whether you're a left government, doesn't matter whether you're a right government. If you're government, there appears to be a protest vote underway right around the world. And interesting if it comes to Australia.
John, just thinking about the differences in policy that Trump might implement, he's spoken about a minimum 10% tariff on all goods coming into the United States and 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. Now, what might the implications be for Australian exports to the US? Not that they're a huge market for us, but perhaps if Chinese exports are hit, it may have implications for commodity prices. So I'm just wondering whether Australia is a potential casualty if Trump does implement those kind of restrictions on Chinese exports. Do you see that as a major issue?
Well, there's positives and negatives, as we know. In the debate, the question was asked, would that be inflationary? And Trump's reply was no, it'll drive business back to America. I don't know whether that answer actually answered the question, but his view was that America would stop supporting international markets, international trade partners, and bring that business back, and there'd be some benefit to inflation. I think that was really a strange comment, not justified. A lot of things he says. If you're going to bring in tariff changes, they've got to be phased. Tariff changes which break free trade agreements would be interesting. So you're actually ripping up free trade agreements, and it would drive the world back away from free trade zones. And America is part of the Pacific, APAC. I mean, these decisions are great to say in debates, but whether in terms of policy and policy directive, when you become president, I doubt whether they'll be followed through. And I think we've got to be very cautious about jumping at statements made in debates. However, I take your point. One reaction would be, on the flip side, that China would cozy up to other markets. Okay, so you take the biggest consumer market out of play. If it happened, China would obviously change their trade focus onto those countries in the Western world who don't have that. And it's interesting, as you know, Paul, that in the last month, China is engaged with Australia on trade and visas. So clearly, the Chinese are going to do what they need to do to protect their economy, and Australia's got to think the same. These sort of changes, we have to think through them and say, well, how can they be turned to the benefit, and not jump at the shadows? So that's what I'd say on that one.
Last point, just before we leave the politics, the bond markets tend to act as a bit of a barrier to big political changes. We saw with Liz Truss how the bond market effectively catapulted her out of Downing Street in a record short time because they didn't believe her budget. And yet the bond markets have behaved reasonably well, both in France and in the US, not seemingly that worried about a change in administration in either country. Do you think that the bond market is being a bit too sanguine, or that the worst is yet to come?
Well, there's 2 points. First point is, do we really think the parliament or the government of countries runs their economy? It's quite clear. I keep on saying it. The central banks and the bureaucracies run economic management. Parliamentarians are talking heads who can make their views known, but when they're actually briefed properly, they change it very quickly. So it doesn't matter who the government is, frankly, around the world today. So say we're going to go left and right, left, right, left. Do you really think that these people are going to change economic policy? Maybe more so in France than England. England's, I don't think it matters who the government is in England. France may be a little bit more extreme. And I also say in America, I don't really think it matters who the president is. In Australia, does it matter? Well, maybe probably in financial services management, stuff like that, which the industry I'm in. I can see there'll be different ways of approaching it, superannuation policy, but essentially the bureaucracy runs the place. The other factor about the bond market, which you made, and the sanguine or lackadaisical view of the bond market, if we're looking at bond yield moves, I put this to you, that I think, and particularly in America, and we've seen the 10-year bond rally a little bit in the last few weeks, and talking to our bond managers inside Climb, our Tory associates and other people, there is a massive amount of American government debt which is rolling at present. And the indications are that the debt is not being rolled into long-dated bonds. So the 10 years bonds and further out are not really being exposed to supply. All the rolling supply in the bond market is at the shorter end. Now, is that a tactic or is that a response to the market? And it has these 2 observations. I think it is a reaction to the fact that there is not a lot of demand for long-dated bonds around the world. which means there's a lot of demand for short-dated bonds. So stay short on the yield curve, take the elevated yield because American cash rates are high, and just sit there and park there, not take what I call capital risk by going up the yield curve. That's an important consideration to understand. But this mountain of debt has to be dealt with. I saw a headline this morning talking about a conference, I won't say which one, where the head speaker is going to say QE is dead. This is a wonderful era coming up for bonds. If anyone thinks QE is dead, given the amount of debt, they are deluded. And I keep on saying this at my presentations, that the bureaucracy and the central banks have to deal with the debt that's been created by governments. And the only way it can be dealt with is a quantitative easing program, particularly in the long-dated part of the market. So watch this space. The other comment about America overnight, and we're talking here, it's probably going to be a solid market, it's solid Australian equity market. But the American stock market value pool went to almost $50 trillion last night at record highs. Now, I'm not worried about record highs. I've never been worried about markets making record highs. But now the American stock market represents 50% of the world GDP. Now, explanation for that is there's a lot of multinational companies. That explains why the American GDP is not relevant to the market cap of the American stock market. But we have to start looking at the valuation, the total valuation of the American stock market compared to world GDP, because the world GDP is the cake. And once you've eaten 50% of the cake up, then you start saying, well, what else is going on? But having said that, there's not a lot of dynamic companies being produced around the world anywhere else. So it's an interesting thought bubble. So I just throw that one in. And the other aspect regarding the bond market, maybe the pressure is not so much in the price or the yield of a bond, okay? The pressure might come in the currency. And for the first time last night, well, not the first time, but we did see the Australian dollar breach 67 cents last night. Is that the start of something? We've got this grinding up of the Aussie dollar. And at the house view of climb is that the Aussie dollar is undervalued for a whole lot of reasons, but we explain it by the fact of flows, that the superannuation flows selling the Aussie dollar to invest offshore. And that's not going to change anytime soon. But it's just interesting that the Aussie dollar's perked up a bit to 67 cents at the same time as the American stock market is reaching 50% of world GDP and American 10-year bonds are rallying. They're all interesting.
John, just bringing it back home to Australia, since we last spoke, we had the May monthly CPI, which came in at 4% versus expectations, I think, of 3.8. That was quite a shock to the market. The market fell 100 points. Is that concerning to you? And then, the following few days, I just read the RBA minutes where I had thought that the chances of a rate rise were really remote, but reading the minutes, there was quite a lot of discussion about potentially raising rates, which certainly surprised me. You have some thoughts on that?
Oh, look, I think the minutes are used cleverly now. It's a feature of the world that, you go back 10 years ago, no one ever read the minutes. The minutes weren't published, weren't publicised. Now it's used as one of the parts of monetary policy to put into the market the thought process of the board, or to put into the market messages which help stabilise the financial system. I treat the minutes as a way of talking about the risk of putting up interest rates currently to get the market to behave against a perceived risk of a yield increase. That's all. It's clever. And then you don't have to follow through. You just say it, and maybe that has the desired effect that demand is slowed if that's the issue you're trying to address, or credit creation is slowed if that's the issue. It just goes into the mix. So I'm not surprised. I don't think it's going to happen. I think you and I both agree we don't believe interest rates will go up in Australia. We believe interest rates are going to come down in America. Interest rates will hold where they are in Australia for longer than expected. But the economy is trundling forward at a very low growth rate. Putting up interest rates would just put that growth rate into negative. for a quarter. Is that what Australia wants to do? I certainly don't think it's what the government wants going into an election. So it's interesting. To your answer, I'm not surprised. I'm not worried. I'm just watching it.
We'll have to end it very soon. Maybe one last question. We've just done the first 6 months of calendar 2024. The US market was up 15%. Australia was up about 5%. Clearly, US technology stocks have been leading the US market. The next 6 months, John, do you think we can do another 5% or 7% and end up with a positive 12% year or something like that? Is that your expectation?
Well, I sort of think the returns are there, but I think more of the returns are going to come from the income side of the return. I really do think that. I think there's a big expectation that yields cash rates will come down, discount rates will come down, and the stock market's jumped on that, as you would expect, because it's looking forward. It continues to rally, the American stock market, and I think we will get some very good numbers in the next few weeks for the June quarter, particularly from those companies which we all know about, that they are growing. And it's a feature of the American market. But outside that sector of the world, that sector of the stock market, can we really say there are dynamic companies producing dynamic returns elsewhere in the world? And with indexing now a big issue, we are getting too much investment flows into a limited amount of stocks now. And I'm not one to go into asset consulting and talk about risk, but as the number of stocks which are reaching new highs and the number of companies which are dynamic is reducing and producing those new highs, then obviously the risk of the market's going up. And that we should be all aware of that. So that's where diversification comes in. And we have to, and particularly clients who are looking after themselves in retirement, have to stay well diversified. And as markets reach new highs in equities, diversification becomes more important. Absolutely. Now, my final point before we sign off, the numbers are out for the last 7 years, balanced returns. I just saw an announcement. The average balanced fund over 7 years is 7.1% return. There are outliers which get 8%, a bit above, but the average return from a balanced fund is 7%. If your question, Paul, is will the next 6 months produce a 3.5% return on a balanced fund, I'd say, yep, I think that's probably likely. That balanced return will be mainly income, in my view, as opposed to capital. And there will be some corrections in equities, I think, coming up in the next 6 months. But over 12 months, I probably think that the equity market will be higher. But I think the higher it goes short term, the more volatility we'll see. But if you're taking a 20-year view, so what? If I'm getting my 7% compound because I'm properly diversified, I've allocated against risk, then we're fine. And that's the discussion you have with your advisors. And that's if you're self-directed, think about it. That's all I'm saying.
Good point to end on, John. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you as always, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Great.